Death is a fascinating subject. It could be said that that's one of the greatest things about life, that there's going to be death. There's going to be a release from all of this. To be completely absolved. Every burden lifted. And death has often been described as euphoric by those that began to die but then slipped back. There's been stories from lifeguards that when they're trying to save people from drowning, that the drowning people actually pull away. So death seems very harsh at first, but once you pass a certain threshold, it almost becomes impossible to resist. And why are people afraid of death? It's the ultimate door of mystery. If you're not an explorer, then what are you? Afraid of the unknown? I don't know about you, but I want to dive head first into the unknown. So death is a fascinating subject. Let's hear what some other people think.
Hi everybody. Here's a subject that you don't often hear on YouTube. I wanted to talk about a couple years I worked in the morgue back in the 70s. First, I just want to say I have Asperger's, and so things I can say a lot of does and uhs and kind of get stuck on things. I don't usually do this sort of camera interview, but at any rate, I'm going to try to make this story as short as possible so I don't bore you. Back when I was a little kid, my father was a pathologist, and if you don't know what that is, it's a type of physician that studies diseases and spends a lot of time doing autopsies, postmortems. And when I was a little kid, about 6 years old, my dad, and this was back in the 60s, in the early 60s, my dad took me to the hospital where he worked. And this was really, 50 years ago. And when he took me in the back entrance, special doctor's entrance, and when he checked in, he flipped this switch which had his name on it, and it was very high-tech for the time, totally high-tech, and I was very impressed. And so for the longest time, with my dad being a doctor, I wanted to be a doctor myself. So as the years went by and I got to be a teenager, I wanted to work in a hospital and do something in the hospital. And I finally got a job in a public hospital, a county public hospital that was affiliated with a university medical school and the local nursing schools too. So there were nursing and medical students all over the place. And the job I got was called transportation orderly. And our job was to move patients around in stretchers and wheelchairs from place to place, And mostly when I worked in the second shift, I mostly worked in the recovery room and intensive care unit. And I was, you know, for the late 70s, that was the highest tech place to be. And, well, it was my cup of tea. The other part of our job was to let people deliver bodies to the morgue. And that hospital also happened to have been the county morgue. And so for 2 years, when I was 18, 19 years old, I worked in the morgue. And that's what I want to talk about. And I'm not going to get to the grisly area of it. I want to keep to the philosophical aspects of my time working in the morgue. Forrest Gump said life is like a box of chocolates. Well, so is death. You know, you never know what you're going to get. And that was my experience in the morgue. At the age of 19, you know, I really wasn't particularly apprehensive about working in the morgue. And I had a lot of curiosity. And it was someplace, it was not like working at McDonald's or Burger King or something when you're 19 years old. You're working with police and coroners and pathologists, and you know, and you're seeing crime scenes and all kinds of stuff. And so it's very exciting. Okay, let's use the word exciting. After several months of working there, I noticed the place kind of reminded me of a motel. Especially since our busiest times were on the weekend. And people would check in Fridays and Saturdays. I mean, it was like 3 times the normal what it would be during the week. It was busy as heck Friday, Saturday night. There were lots of accidents, car accidents, suicide shootings, just accidents in general. And it was a very busy time. This morgue, probably not like what you would see on TV because it was very old. The hospital had been constructed in the late 19th century, late 1800s, and I think that's about the time that the morgue was built, the coolers. And so there was about, I believe, like 4 times 3. There were 12 coolers. 12 of these coolers, slabs that went in and out, was stacked 3 high. I never put anybody on the highest cooler because, well, it was very impractical to get to, but we would fill up the bottom 2 coolers full of people. And then in the back of the area where the cooler was, there was a rarely used autopsy room with an autopsy table, basically a heavy steel table with a sink on it. And then there were some more refrigerators back there, not more coolers, but like freezers or refrigerators. And sometimes they would do autopsies there for certain circumstances, but normally they would do an autopsy in the lab on the 2nd floor. And so if they wanted to do an autopsy, they would transport the person to the 2nd floor pathology, and they would perform the autopsy there. So generally on the weekends, the hospital was pretty quiet for the rest of my duties, but it was fairly busy with the morgue. And they would bring in a lot of, the police would bring in people who had been killed or committed suicide. And when they came in, you could see that it basically was like a shell. You know, the person that it was just a shell of a person. And I think that is when really my atheism took hold, at that time, when I saw different things that made a big impression on me and told me that there was no Jesus who cared about you. Because not only did I check in people who were murdered and were victims, but I also brought down preemies and stillborns and such from the delivery, labor and delivery. And they would call me up there and they would hand me a baby, or sometimes more than one baby, 2 or 3 babies. And they would be wrapped up in like what you, well, I hate to say this, but what you would package meat with. But you could tell it was a baby. And no need to bring a stretcher because they were so small, so I would just carry them in my arms down to the morgue. And I would check them in and open the slab, and I would carefully put these babies in there. And that probably affected me more than anything else, was taking these babies down there to the morgue. It affected me more. I rarely really got affected by seeing other people brought in there. Probably nothing at all, really. But the babies were affected me some, you know. It seemed sad and unfair, but such as it was. And I think I realized how random life was. I also want to mention, at that age, 19 years old, it was really hard to picture oneself that you would be there one day. It was almost more like seeing a car accident on the side of the road, you know, a horrible car accident. You're like, wow. But you never think, hey, that's going to happen to me one day. I'm going to be, you know, laying there decapitated in a car accident, you know, dead or whatever. You just don't, it's hard to really get that down into your brain, you know, that's going to be you one day, that somebody is going to be pushing you into a cooler. But in a way, it does kind of, it lingers in your brain. You also, on a kind of a day-to-day basis, we spent so much time in the morgue, probably at least half the day, that it almost seemed like you had 1 foot in life and 1 foot in death every day. And you, at that time, you know, being a kid, I didn't really dwell on it excessively, but I did think about it sometimes. I did think about, you know, how random life was. That we got everything in there. We got everything from really elderly people, you know, with no teeth and gums, and they were, you know, they looked already dead, to middle-aged people, industrial accidents, shootings, fire, people taken out of the river, you name it. I mean, all kinds of ages, everything you can imagine. And like, for example, you take like, excuse me, an industrial accident. We used to get people who were, say, like construction workers, and they would fall off go to work and normal day at work, and they would get hit by something in the head, or something would fall on them, or they would fall off, they would die. And they would bring in these construction guys who looked like construction workers, and they had a big dent in their head, and they were dead. And they weren't expecting that day to die. But that was that. So you just realize how anytime, you know, your time could come. That would be it. Boom, snap, you're dead. I think also, in a way, it kind of made me appreciate life, because I don't think if I ever worked in something like that, in a way I kind of consider it like being in a war or something, when you see this sort of thing, and versus a normal sort of life, you're working at a deli or something, that you realize that any time, you know, you could step into the shower and slip and boom, hit your head, you're dead. That's it. People come home, they find you dead in the bathroom or an aneurysm or anything. So I realized that, and I basically am the kind of person who try to make the most out of my pathetic life, such as it is. And I'm not saying I enjoy life all the time, because I don't. And in some ways, I find life kind of miserable. I think that if I wasn't living in a first world country with all the stuff that we have, you know, money, cars, jobs, houses, whatever, I think I would have killed myself. You know, I'm not the kind of person who would want to live in a much more minimal existence. Fortunately, for most of my life, and I'm now 55, it hasn't been that way. It hasn't been pleasant all my life, but it's certainly not to what you would find in the third world.
This is my favourite tree. Beautiful. Far older than it should be. See what I mean? Far older than it should be able to get. The reason for that is, you can probably hear, it's got its feet in the river that passes right by it. This tree is just down the hill and around the corner from where I live. Just like death. I've seen and know the beauty in death, the love in death. I've known death. I can't exactly personify it, but some of the experiences that I had, it did seem surprisingly like a being. Far more than I've ever conceived or felt any deity or, you know, the source of all things has a personality other than the personalities of all of us and everything. Death seemed to have a particular persona to me. And these weren't bad. I think death also pulls you up short. There's a saying, which pretty much everybody knows, that goes, live every day as if it were your last. And I don't think any of us actually achieve that. Not entirely. Some of them get closer than others. Some don't do it at all. Some live totally in the past, totally in the future. I think the less you can do that, the more you can live in the moment, the less you'll regret death when it comes, actually. But I was very intimate with death for a period of time. Not because it came from me, but because it came from my mother. And she handed her entire life into my hands. And I told death, because she and I were very pragmatic about it, which seemed to completely freak out all the medics and an awful lot of other people as well, which talked about it openly and realistically, which seemed logical to me and to her. She could have died in two very different ways. One was a very gradual decline, letting go piece by piece until she just faded away. And the other was to have died in absolute agony, and this was related to her condition. Those were the two options. I told death which one she wanted and which one I wanted, which was the former. She wanted to die slowly, gradually, piece by piece. And it's what she got. Now, whether my telling death that's what could happen had any impact on it whatsoever, it's really, in some cases, an irrelevance. I am happy with the fact that she got what she wanted. but we came incredibly close. Now, we've always been reasonably close, but every last barrier was removed because we knew it was our last opportunity, our last chance to be close, to express who we were, to connect. And so it was actually a really beautiful time. An odd time, that's for sure, but a very beautiful one. Death, it also seems to me, had a very mischievous side. There were many times when I just felt like I was being played with. It was like the jester, court jester, dancing in and out, playing these bizarre games with us. And I went with that because there was little else that I could do. But I came very close to it, and what I discovered in my closeness to it was that there, in that moment, because death ultimately is a moment, is, if you allow it to be, if you dare to take down your barriers, pure love, pure connection, pure source. I also lost a dear friend towards the end of last year. So death's been around me a lot recently. And that was very peculiar too. I'd originally met him at YouTube, got to know him in real life. I'd known him about 5 years. And we came in and out of each other's lives quite a bit. There were times when we needed gaps, and we understood that. Very shortly before he died, he came and commented on a video of mine, and he was talking about the stairway to heaven, curiously. He had no idea he was going to die, not consciously, there's the thing. He was incredibly agitated about something. And he'd come to me to ask me for help with it. And basically I told him, if you're banging your head against a wall every time you attempt this, maybe you need to go a different way. And he let go. It was tangible, his letting go of that. I don't think either of us realised that what he was actually letting go of was life. He came to me the night before he died, and he said two things. One was, how many times are you going to save me? To which I said, I've never saved you. You've always saved yourself. And he also said to me, there are so many things I want to ask you now. And then he was gone. And he died too, exactly the way he wanted to. Which was very suddenly, peacefully, unexpectedly, in his sleep. His heart just stopped. And yet these people live on in me. And all the people that know them. The death is a gift, as I see it. People complain about, people want physical immortality. But if we didn't have an ending, if we didn't have cycles, then we wouldn't appreciate any of it. We'd just become bored with it. That is our nature. Look, this beautiful tree, that's not mine, of mine, it feels like mine, it's dropped some bits this winter. Look, see? It lives on. It will go on living on, probably way after I've vanished. And on its branch that it has dropped, there's another one here, is covered in moss and lichen. Other life lives on the death of this piece of the tree. And I think there's an element of that for us too. I've never been frightened of death. I've worked with it a lot. The mode of death, I think, is relevant. You asked if there was anything unusual, strange about death experiences. And I don't think this is strange. It doesn't feel strange to me. It feels like normality. I could tell all sorts of stories. My mother wanted me to go with her. She wanted me to take that journey with her. I went as far as I could. But I tasted death. That feels like a gift to me.
This is a video about death. When Hamlet left this world, the best English writer, poet, Shakespeare, said this, describing his death. He simply said, he died. Nothing more, nothing less. Such beautiful words. There is 250,000 deaths a day in this world. And surely they cannot all be singers. The question then becomes, what is your death worth to society? Did you lead a good life worth living? Or did you pity yourself? And thanks to this BS we call religion, there is a great shadow area regarding this question, what happens to us after we die? As some sort of a payout, because we are selfish and we want something in return, that this life was shitty and hopefully there's something else out there that is less shitty. Because after all, as I said, we are selfish. So what happens to us after we die? No one really knows. But this is what I know. In your life, when you live, cells are breaking down as we speak. But then, the hippocampus dies 5 seconds after your heart goes. So that means your memories, everything that you were, doesn't exist anymore. Your memories die with it. This will not be you. It's simply organic matter helping out nature to grow. That is it. Life is not just a test. This is it, folks. So when I die in my surfing scenario accident and the waves carry me to my final resting place and I become food for different animals, I'm helping out this world live just a little bit longer. I will want my epitaph after I get my invisible body final resting place is at Memorial VA Cemetery. I will love my epitaph to say, I have gone out to find myself. If I come back before I return, please keep me here until I get back. And sadly, when people ask my family what happened to me, they will simply say, and I hope they'll simply say, he died. Nothing more, nothing less. The way I think about death is I have an animal mentality. So, he fucking died. What are we gonna do with the body? People put so much stock into the death and dying of others that they don't let the dying rest. You want to keep them alive just a little bit longer. You want to make them suffer just a little bit longer for your own selfish reasons, because you don't want to let them go. Because seeing them or letting them go will cause you great pain, great suffering, and you don't want to go through that. And this is only natural when people feel sad for the dying. It's natural that you cry when they die. It's shocking, it hurts. But don't be sad because they died. Be happy for the life they lived. Be happy for what they did. It's only natural to feel sorry, to feel some sort of a guilt. Don't. Just be happy for the life they lived. And be happy that you actually got to know them when they were alive. To me, that is beautiful. For me, we don't think about dying enough. It's such a wonderful exercise. It's such a uplifting exercise to think about your own death and how you will handle your own death. To me, it's a wonderful, wonderful exercise. And we think, and I think, for example, that we should think about dying more often, because it just makes it worthwhile. If you want this life to mean something, to have meaning, then think about dying and think about what you need to do in order for your life to have a purpose, for society to say, well, his life meant something. And then simply when somebody asks, well, what happened to him or her? Well, he died. Now, I was on Bells Beach, Australia when it happened. I was about to catch my second to last set, and it was a perfect wave. It was almost 11 feet, and that's the way I like them. So I'm riding, I hit it from the right side, and I was just cruising. All of a sudden, this tube kind of closes. It was creating the tubes. I was like, yes, I'm inside this tube. I'm going to be inside this tube. I'm going to own it. Then, to my right side, there's this clear plastic bag. And I remember, oh, that's a cool freaking looking plastic bag. It almost looked organic. And then I thought, wait a minute, that is organic. And that's no plastic bag, that's a box jellyfish. And there's a lot of box jellyfish around that area, so be careful. But anyway, I remember it was coming closer. I was like, oh crap. It's coming closer, it's gonna touch me. That's the only thing I can think about, it's gonna touch me. And yes, the first tentacle touched me here. And then the rest, since I was, like trying to avoid it, the rest hit my calf, and my calf got the worst. It was like a couple of welts, like 4 welts around my arm, but just my leg just got brutalized. It looked really red, red hot pokers. And I was like, and I remember the first feeling, it felt like, a couple of rubber bands just really closing together on skin. You know how that feeling is? That's how it feels. Rubber band on skin. And I thought, wait, well, I guess done. But I felt a little off, but it didn't hurt. I was just like a little burning, not that bad. But as soon as I got out of the water, the pain just overtook me. I couldn't even walk. It just dropped me, and the first thing that happened was just muscle spasms, like you wouldn't believe. It was like red hot pokers on muscles, just poking back and forth. That was the feeling, that was the sensation of it. And I remember I lost everything, every content that I have I just lost, because it was just so painful, and I never experienced pain like that before. As soon as we got to the hospital, I lost consciousness. Just the pain was so overwhelming that I lost consciousness. My brain was just flowing with epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin. It was just, alright, just gonna shut you down, just whatever. So I lost consciousness. I died for 90 seconds. 90 seconds. I didn't remember when they shocked me. I don't remember anything. But in those 90 seconds, they said I was gone. I don't remember those 90 seconds. But I had this feeling that it was one of the most beautiful 90 seconds of my entire life. I felt so utterly and completely at peace. I didn't experience it like mechanics machine else or no out-of-body experience. looking at my body. No, I didn't experience any of that. I didn't experience anything. It was just darkness, black, isolated darkness. But it was just so peaceful, so beautifully peaceful that I actually got what life was. Life is love. Life is suffering. Life is pain. But wait a minute. This nothingness felt more real, more spiritually calming than anything that I've ever experienced in my life. For me, that was the moment that I thought, well, maybe that's what Buddha and all these yogis were talking about. Complete and utter calmness. When you understand what your consciousness is trying to tell you, what consciousness really is. Nothingness. I loved it. And the third time I got stung by a box jellyfish, yeah, it happened more than once. I got this tattoo, but the first time that my leg got just the worst of it all, my calf, I got a tattoo. It's of a warlord riding a wolf, and wolves signify, they have a lot of meaning in my life for me. So that's what it is. This leg contributed to my experience of what I experienced, and I came through because I am a warlord. I'm back for more. I will surf until I die. Sort of. That's what this tattoo means, and I'm going to show you. Hopefully you can see it. If not, anyway, that's my experience. Complete and utter nothingness. And it was the most beautiful thing I have ever experienced.
Witnessing death has sort of been an evolution for me, I suppose. Remember, as a young kid, I saw the death of my grandparents and, really didn't think too much about what happened to them. And so, later on in life, I lost one of my grandparents that I was really, really attached to, and it got me to thinking, what happened to him? I miss him. What happened? What did he experience during the process? What happened after? So I turned to religion for the answers, and they comforted me temporarily. I thought that there was a reason for existence, that there was some sort of gold at the end of the rainbow, I believed this. And it seemed fine enough for me until I had my own, I'd say, glimpse of death. I was having problems with a subarachnoid brain cyst, and I was dying from it. Had been dying from it for about 8 months. I didn't know it, had the scan, found out, uh-oh, something's really wrong. This needs to be fixed soon. After the third surgery, things started going awry with my heart. My heart started going, bonkers. It seemed to do with the pressure being took off of the cyst. It's like my brain got used to all that pressure. I guess the pressure was so great that it squirted onto the surgery floor like a squirt gun. But when that was fixed, the heart went crazy, and it landed me in the ER with a heart rate of 300 beats a minute. I was pretty scared. I thought I was going to meet this maker of sorts. That never turned out to be. Well, they didn't like my heart going that fast. They thought it would kill me after a certain amount of time, so they injected me with this stuff, and I don't know what it is. Med student might be able to say. It stopped my heart. Well, when this happened, my heart started to feel like a big block of rubber with an elephant sitting on my chest. But it wasn't pain. It was intense, but it wasn't really painful. My heart and my body started feeling the same. It started to feel the effects of the lack of oxygen, and it's like one of those times where we've all leaned on our limb for too long and we couldn't really move the limb too well, and then we let it get blood flow back, and then it's fine. Well, the whole body feels like that, and it's quite intense. It can be scary if you let it. I try not to let it. I looked at my parents because I knew the seconds, of oxygen in my brain were about to go out. I was staring right in both of their eyes. And then it happened. I guess the stuff kind of worked for too long. I mean, my heart's restarted, but it was just enough just to give me this strange glimpse. And it didn't have any... I didn't have like a fantastical experience with a light in a tunnel and a loving God and all this stuff. Nothing like that happened, but it was a feeling of a void. It was a feeling of an infinite subtraction in like an explosion of consciousness. I don't know. I'm laughing at myself because I don't know how to put it. I was aware of it, but it wasn't a me that it was aware of it. I can't really put it into words, but there you go. Anyways, after this, what changed me is I've been questioning things ever since. A lot of people get annoyed with me, that believe in dogma or don't really think about it at all. I get them to think about it, and come on, I don't want to think about it. I want to think about, life, details, positivity. So that's how it's changed me. I see things differently. I don't see life as full of meaning. I don't see it as exactly pointless, but I don't see any meaning behind it anymore. There is nothing at the end of the rainbow. There is no gold at the end of the rainbow. So, but I have come to the conclusion that even though it is meaningless, you can give it meaning. It's like a painting, a canvas. It's like you can look at creation, if you will, as a blank canvas, and you are an expression of it. You are the painting. It probably sounds foolish, but that's what I think of it as now. The expression gives it meaning, if it wants. But that is how death has changed my life. It has opened me up, too. I have had experiences of trying to think here. What do you call it? Lucid dreams. Visits. After of my deceased family members after the experience. So it has opened me up to more experiences and just to question things, to get other people to think about, what exactly is existence. Get them to think about it. Most of the time I stump people. They say they don't want to think that hard, or some of them get a little offensive about it. They don't like it to think about that kind of thing. So I have to lay off and okay, But that's how it has changed me.
Well, it might sound like a silly kind of a thing to say, but I feel as if I've been studying death most of my life. First time I witnessed a fatal injury, I was 6 years old, sitting in a bus with a window seat overlooking the highway, and the kid who sat behind me in first class in infant school chased a ball between the two buses in front of the bus I was sitting in. I heard the screech of the tyres, I looked out the window, I saw the Mini Miner standing on its nose wheels with smoke coming out from under the wheels, and I could see his hand on his arm up above the bonnet. His fingers were grasping for something to hang on to, and I was looking through the back window of the Mini Miner and through the windscreen. Well, that was the first time I saw a fatal injury, and he lived for 3 days. The next year, one of the girls in my class was playing on the weekend in a tree with a skipping rope with wooden handles. Now, her father had died the previous year, so she was a fatherless waif, and nobody ever knew whether she meant to kill herself or whether she just fell out of the tree and caught herself by the neck with the skipping rope. The next 12 months was incident free, you might say, and when I was in 4th class, one of the kids in my maths class was shot by his big brother through the heart with the father's .22. Big brother had been cleaning it, and he'd been dry firing it, and there wasn't enough fire discipline in his instruction for him to know that you should never point any gun-shaped object at anything unless you'd be prepared to shoot that thing. So, not realising that he'd already put the magazine back in, he worked the action, pointed it at his little brother, and shot him through the heart. So, that was primary school. The next time I saw death up close and personal, it was in a formal setting. I was a student nurse at Tamworth Base Hospital, and during our preliminary training school they gave us a 3-day seminar on death and dying based on the book about the stages of grief by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. So, in 1980, when I was 19 and the first time I had a patient actually die and I had to lay them out, I had a pretty fair amount of emotional preparation for it, but it was still quite a heavy event. There's a big difference between a person who has a soul in their body and a person who used to have a soul in their body. It's a major quantum shift, it's just totally different. But well, Tamworth Base Hospital and I didn't get along too well, and after a month on the wards I found myself reapplying at Concord Repat, which was a much bigger hospital. And well, down there I got to study death for 3 years, because World War II was a long time ago, even in the 1980s, and we had a fair bit of death as student nurses. And some of the witnessings of death were macabre and some were fairly bizarre, like the macabre would encompass the time I sent a patient, or I escorted a patient down to nuclear medicine, and while he was down having a scan on his cancer of the everything, he died. And the sister in charge of the nuclear medical ward didn't want or have the facilities to lay out a corpse. So one of the other students from my training group went down to collect this patient, and they had the bloke sitting up on a trolley wearing an oxygen mask, absolutely dead. And my friend, who was also a first year student nurse, did as he was told and wheeled the corpse back through the entire hospital. He got to the elevators and the corpse's son came running to join the elevator because he hoped for one last glimpse of his father, and there were some pretty awkward explanations in the elevator leading back up to the ward. So that's kind of the macabre. The bizarre would encompass an enormously overweight corpse on a trolley with omnidirectional wheels and a slight slope leading down to the morgue, and losing control of the trolley on the slope in the rain and actually sideswiping and denting a car that was parked. So yeah, there were some strange things happened around death. One of the things I learned at Concord was that if you know somebody's going to die and they're anxious about it, you probably should tell them about it, because it's not real fun for them when it comes as a surprise. And I had a handover report one morning and they told me that a fella had a tumour in his lungs, and we weren't to tell him because that was the doctor's job. And he was pumping me for information because he knew that I knew, and I wasn't allowed to tell him. And I came out from the bathroom with a different patient, turned around and watched this fella with a great fountain of blood, you know, coming metres out of his mouth because the tumour had chewed through his pulmonary artery, and he was drowning. And he locked eyes on me as he fell to the floor, and the look in his eyes said, "You bastard, you knew this was going to happen." And I hadn't told him. Another one that really kind of sticks in the mind. There was a bloke who was drunk driving, again in a Mini Minor, and he had a sober hitchhiker, and he drove his Mini Minor with such verve and precision that he snapped a telegraph pole off at ground level. And he mashed his own pelvis up pretty bad, and I was scouting nurse in operating theatre while they were working on putting the bones back together in the pelvis and the legs of the bloke who was driving the car. But I also got to be scout nurse when they took the kidneys out of the passenger. And he was this 21-year-old bloke, and he was wheeled into operating theatre, and yes, he was on a respirator, but when they took the respirator off him, he was still breathing. And all of his paperwork was filled out. And it was my job as the scout nurse, after they stuck a suction pipe up his aorta and his heart went into overdrive and his body lifted up off the bloody operating table despite the anaesthetic, and all of his lifeblood pumped into the vacuum bottles beside me, it was my job to note the time that his heart actually stopped and write it on his death certificate, because they'd already filled it in and signed it before they sent him up to us. Right? I've done a surgical murder on somebody to harvest their kidneys, and I have a very low opinion of the entire transplant industry ever since. They are fucking ghouls. And ghoulish behaviour is something that I know a little bit about, because we used to actually compete with each other for proof of how closely we had witnessed death in real life. And we actually kept souvenirs and took notes. Here's your world's fastest course in electrocardiology. This is what it's meant to look like. And the runner-up in the Group 4 1980 competition to record the sickest possible electrocardiogram was this bloke coming into casualty in the middle of a heart attack. I'm pretty sure he did not die that day. Unlike this particular individual, who I was told at handover report at 7 o'clock in the morning, they said, "He's your patient. He's had 2 cardiac arrests during the night. He's been resuscitated twice. And the doctors have decided that when this flask of medication runs out, and it's between him and his God theory and his heart muscle, how much longer he lives." So, it's not quite like an infantryman in the field keeping a necklace of ears, but this is the real-time electrocardiogram of the final heartbeat, which won Warbles the honours of the sickest possible electrocardiogram that you can record in real life. So, after 3 years of that level of intensity, off I went to be sister in charge of the Vegetable Creek Hospital at Emmaville. When I was a second year student nurse, I had occasion to want to shoot myself. The girlfriend's father had died. I had to tell her that he was dead. She thought that, you know, if she just got rid of me, then it would take away the pain, and I went down that spiral depressive track where you get drunk. And the girlfriend who drove me to drink, followed me and then called the police, you know, and in the meantime she told me that yes, you should shoot yourself. So I spent some time sitting there sucking on a gun barrel. And I had a déjà vu, I had a flash forwards. And I was trapped at ceiling height and I couldn't get out of the room. and I had a deep understanding that because I had chosen to die in the room, therefore I was stuck in the room. And there was no body on the ground, but there was a big mess of blood and brains and bones and bits of shit all over the wall behind where my head had been. And then the two little old cleaning ladies came in. And they were talking Yugoslavian, but I could understand them. And they said, isn't it a pity that he's killed himself over an argument with a girlfriend whose face he would not have been able to remember if he just got on with life and lived for another 5 years. And the next thing I knew, I was no longer a disembodied ghost stuck in the room. I was spitting the gun barrel out. Right? Now, I had that near-death experience in my second year of nursing, after I'd traced other people's moment of death. And in the third year, I was watching a television interview with Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who's brought out a new book where she'd studied a couple of thousand people who'd had near-death experiences. And she was talking to a combat veteran, and his near-death experience had consisted of floating up and flying out from the casualty clearing station back to the paddy field where he'd lost both his legs and one arm. And while he was a ghost in the paddy field, he couldn't get out of the paddy field. And he couldn't drop any of his equipment, but he had both his legs and his arm. And if he shouted in the ear of somebody who he'd been, you know, platoon mates with, they'd sort of wipe at their ear as if there was a mosquito buzzing around. And then he got sucked up out of the paddy field and flew back at jet fighter speed to the casualty clearing station, and as he went back in through the roof of the tent, he got a pin-sharp image of a surgical team turning away from the body that they were working on, that they had not been able to do much with, and they went over and picked his body out of the pile of red tags which had been considered too far gone to work on. And as the bottle of stable plasma protein solution went into his IV, that's when he went thump back into his body and he woke up in the recovery ward. So I've had a bit of experience of near-death experiences, you know, the déjà vu type, which line up with what other people have had to say. And I'm pretty sure that death is a new beginning in not the material world, but you're in the first and lowest heaven of the earth. You're right here where we are now. But there are limitations, and it all kind of depends on what spiritual learnings you've made for yourself while you were alive. If you've learnt that the stock market's all that matters, well, your ghost will go back to the stock exchange and you'll hover around contributing to the atmosphere of a bull or a bear market. If booze is all that matters, then off you'll go back to the pub and contribute to the atmosphere of have another drink for the road. But anyway, when I went to work at Vegetable Creek, all I knew is that death is a natural, unavoidable thing, and you might as well do it with some dignity. So when the old people who'd already spent one winter tied up in a chair with dementia, when they got a cold, I'd ring their relatives, the near ones, and say, look, talk it over with the far-flung relations, discuss whether you want somebody to come up and talk to the doctor, and make a decision tomorrow morning about whether your ancient relative is going to get antibiotics or not, because if you don't think they need another winter on the veranda, tied into the chair shitting themselves, don't give them the antibiotics, because pneumonia was called the old person's friend. And after setting that little cart in motion, a couple of times I've had to sit there and hold the hand of the ancient relative when the far-flung relations have come back to say goodbye, but they don't want to be there for the Chain-Stokes respirations and the last gasp. And it was my responsibility. Second last time I had a really close look at a fatal injury was in 1994, when a neophyte called Quentin strapped into an advanced rated hang glider and got towed into the ground by a different tow team, a tug flown by a man who did not believe that there was any need to have a ground-based observer in command of the launch. And at the time, I knew that we were pretty good, but I did not realise that Aero Towing Adventures Australia were actually the world leaders in safely aero towing hang gliders. And I had to send my crash analysis to the Civil Aviation Safety Authority to get the pilot-induced oscillation and lockout index made mandatory industry standard for aero towing training operations. Sadly, though I helped resuscitate Quentin, he lived for only 3 days, but my method was made mandatory industry standard for all aero towing operations after only one more person died. And the last time I witnessed death right up close was when I identified Canada John, my best friend, who came to me for advice about aeroplanes, you see. And I wrote his crash analysis for the police and the coroner, and identified him in a body bag. And I keep his relics. But life does go on.